Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for such a great introduction, Jeff. And I actually got started with the Deber interest at Tennessee, working with Beth Schussler. And so I got to give my shout out to Beth. She's amazing, and yeah, and definitely carried a lot of that on at University of Minnesota. And so obviously, it takes a village, and so I'm gonna start out with the village around me that has helped made all the work that I'm going to present on today possible. Right, I'm going to talk a little bit today about some of the ongoing work that my graduate student Madison Nelson is doing with some identities in STEM, as well as some work done by graduate students Randy Cannon, Lauren Clance, as well as my postdoc Dr. Angela Google. And lab undergrads, Darian, Grace Sakaya, and Zachary McMullen, right? Without all of these people, none of this would be possible. And so I want you to see all of these great faces when I'm talking about this work. And really need to shout out a lot of really honest and brave undergraduates that were willing to share their experiences and opinions with us, right? So without all these amazing undergrads at University of South Alabama, none of this work would have been possible. And so I'm gonna take us back through time a little bit, and I'm gonna go back to Knoxville, right? And we're gonna go back to a certain day, right? And so we're gonna go back to about 2012, first day of intro ecology class, right? So this was my first time as an instructor in the class. I was thrown up in front of these students with about 3 days advance notice that I was teaching ecology, and was given a syllabus and told good luck, right? And so I did how I did exactly the things that I experienced when I was an undergrad, right? So I immediately wanted to learn the students' names and connect those to the faces. And so how did I do that? I pulled out my, the roll call and went down the roll and took roll in that class, right? Calling out students' names and connecting it to the faces, thinking that was the best way possible. Right, and so we're gonna build up with a little bit of a story, right? So I'm gonna introduce you to a few students that I was introduced to through that role. Right, so the first student that I experienced was Rachel. Rachel, I found out from my roll call that she was a sophomore, and she was from Brentwood, Tennessee, which is if y'all don't know, is a nice little affluent suburb of Nashville, right? And Rachel had preferred to be called Paige, right? Because she had lots of Rachels in her class. I think this is probably, she was born about the heyday of Friends, right? Lots of Rachels. So she preferred to be called Paige. I found out, through a little bit of pre-course conversation that Paige was a pre-med in there. Her parents were both UT alum. And she just seemed really, really comfortable in this academic setting, right? You could tell that she had some experience in this world. This next student that I came to was Anthony, right? And Anthony was a junior from Warner Robins, Georgia, right? A high school football powerhouse, right? And when Anthony walked in, he was dressed in head to toe UT orange, which is unmistakable shade of orange. And Anthony was this beautiful Adonis of a man, right? He was 6'6", 240 pounds of just cut lean meat, right? And it was obvious that he was a student athlete, right? And Anthony immediately became a focal point in the class when I called Anthony's name out, and everyone realized, yes, that is indeed Anthony, the starting outside linebacker for the football team. Right, so he immediately became everybody's favorite person in that class. Right, and then the last student was Jennifer. So my role told me that Jennifer was a sophomore from Morristown. Even though it was a warm kind of Tennessee fall day, Jennifer was wearing a winter hat, a big bulky sweatshirt. She sat in the back corner. She was really quiet. And then he told me that his actual preferred name was Jonathan, and that he actually had to do that when I called out Jennifer in class, and he informed me of his proper preferred name. Right. And so after getting introduced to all my students, we then kind of talked about some of the ins and outs of what we're going to be working through in this class, right? Intro ecology. I don't want to get them excited, right? I wanted to show them that they were going to be exposed to some of the foundation literature in ecology, right? So who are we going to be talking about in this class, right? Obviously, we're going to be talking about Darwin, right? And talking about all the important work with connecting, natural selection with evolution. And then we're going to talk about some biogeography and some of the classic work of von Humboldt. Right, we're going to talk about some finches or some warblers and some trees, and we're going to talk about some of the work by Robert MacArthur. And then we're going to transition to think about island biogeography theory and E.O. Wilson. And then because we were at Tennessee, we had to talk about Dan Simberloff and some of the empirical tests of island biogeography theory that he did as a graduate student. And then we're going to talk about plant ecology, and we got to talk about Grimes. And then finally, we're going to talk a little bit about phenology changes and climate change. And we're going to talk about some of the work that was done by David Inouye. Right. And so I presented this kind of wall of white men, as I like to call it, right? Of this is the foundation, that this is who ecologists are. And so flash forward a couple weeks, right, into the semester, right? This is a field ecology based course, right? Checking in with everybody, right? So Anthony, a few weeks in, really wasn't overly engaged to be in this class, right? He wasn't excited to be out doing these experiments, right? He was super passive in his group, and that was okay with others, right? As long as Anthony wanted to be in their group, they were totally cool with that, right? And he totally let others take the lead. He did what he needed to do, but he didn't go above and beyond, right? He was just trying to get through. Paige was super, super engaged. She was really, really intuitive. She was a really deep thinker. She was awesome. But I often found that she was defaulting to others in her group to make decisions. And she would kind of passively sit back and allow others in her group to make these terrible decisions. And even though she knew they were wrong, she was like, I'm not going to say anything. We'll let this go. Right. And she kind of remained silent. And then finally, Jonathan, he didn't want to be part of a group. He really struggled in this class. He wanted to work alone. I really pushed him, though. I was really pushing him to be involved in a group. Field ecology is a really hard class to take on a brunt of these projects alone. And I really, really wanted him to be in a group. And I really didn't listen when he told me that. And so eventually, Jonathan just withdrew and just kind of quit ecology midway through the semester. And so going to make y'all kind of jump in here. What did I do wrong, right? So I did probably lots of things, lots of cringeworthy moments. Even thinking back and talking about it now, I cringe. So what did I do wrong? Any ideas? And you can feel free to throw them in the chat. Yes, yeah, the wall of white men is not ideal. Right, exactly, right? I did not push Jonathan why I was pushing him to work in a group. I did tell him that it would be easier, and that was about the extent of it. What other things did I do? And you can feel free to just shout out too. You don't have to go for the chat.
Just thinking about setting up strategies for, I forget the names, but the student who knew better but wasn't confident enough to speak out. So making sure that each student had to speak
Mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely, absolutely. Any other ideas?
You didn't explain how the students should work as a team and kind of help them to, they don't know all the time, so they need to be told kind of how to work in a team more effectively.
Absolutely. I totally agree. I totally agree. And then any other ones? Otherwise, I can jump in. I can jump in. Okay. So I did a lot of things wrong, right? So a lot of things that I think now I'm like, oh, I would have never done that. Right. And the first thing is I outed my student athlete on day one, right? I removed any ability for him to be a student in this class, right? I shined a big spotlight on him when he walked in on day one, right? And it really was like this, right? He was like LeBron leaving the arena here, where everyone just wanted high fives, everyone wanted to be his friend, and he just couldn't even be he couldn't be a student in this class. Right? I outed my trans student in the front of the entire class on the first day of class. There was never any point that I could come back from that. Right? I outed him, and he had to suffer the consequences because of that on day one. And then when he told me he wanted to work alone, I didn't listen. Right? So Jonathan was constantly misgendered by his peers. And so he wanted to work alone, and I simply just didn't listen to him. And then I told, as the first person jumped in, right, I gave them that wall of white men, right? So only clean cut men, white men, maybe some bearded ones too, can be the important ecologists, right? And so I completely removed Rachel and Anthony's ability to see themselves being able to be successful in this class, or being able to be a leader in this class. And then I also made just tons of assumptions about all of my students, right? So I assumed, because Rachel was from Brantwood, that she was upper class, right? I knew I made lots and lots of assumptions, and we know what happens when we make assumptions about anyone or anything, right? And as someone that most of my research, is guided by kind of linkages between community, ecology, and ecosystem function, and really documenting the importance of biodiversity and how it shapes ecosystem function. How was I so blind to that topic when moving it from a plant community or microbial community and moving it into my classroom, right? And the reflection after this first semester, I was like, I was blind. I'm blind. This is my focal area. And I don't think I'm alone. And I think this is a really common problem that we experience as educators and teachers, especially early on in the ballgame. Right. And because we know that we have some huge issues in STEM, right? We know that STEM, students from historically excluded identities choose to leave STEM fields at disproportionate rates, right? And so we often see this as this pipeline analogy, right? A leaky pipeline. And in this example, right, I've just pulled Black chemists, right, or African-American chemists, right? But we can draw these very similar pipeline analogies for almost any other identity that we want to think about, right? Other racial, ethnic groups, gender expressive groups, right? First gen college students, transfer students, right? Anyone that doesn't really seem to fit this mold of who we think STEM individuals are, leave our STEM pipeline. And it sucks. It sucks for us as STEM educators, because we're losing out, right? We're losing out on so much amazing talent as these students who don't see themselves as fitting choose to leave. And a lot of our solutions to fix this pipeline right now, think about some of the deficits that these students bring, instead of thinking about kind of the strengths that each of these different identities hold, right? So we think about, oh, well, what can we do for first generation students to catch them up to everybody else, right? But first generation college students bring a ton of strengths and bring a lot of unique insights that aren't aren't exactly prevalent in a lot of college students, right? So we have to start thinking about these as strengths instead of deficits, right? And so how do we start patching some of these leaky pipes, right? And for me, it's focused on, fostering a sense of belonging within our classrooms, right? And so how the heck do we do that, right? Lots of different ways, right? I love, intentionally connecting to my students, right? I spend a lot of time, going one-on-one. I intentionally think about the course construction and to highlight diverse scientists that I bring to bring as examples in class. I spend a lot of time trying to understand and think about the student experience in my classes, right? I've spent a ton of time trying to build comfort in talking about race, gender, socioeconomic status, sexuality within my classes, right? So I can be comfortable talking to any student that is in front of me, right? And there's a lot of different ways, right? And one of the big ones that, for me is just trying to understand what my classroom looks like through the lens of my student, right? And so one of the big questions that I think a lot about is trying to understand the student experience by viewing our courses through their eyes, right? So we're going to start out, obviously I'm a young faculty member and all of my DBER research is going to be linked with COVID. It's an unfortunate timing, but I think COVID also provides us a really kind of cool context to think about student experience right now. And so if you can think back to that COVID semester, that spring 2020 semester, what are some words that come to mind when you think about that semester? Yeah, chaos, scary, stressful, scared. Yes, never ending spring break, uncertainty. Yes, these are all fantastic, right? So for me, when I think back, one more, the pivot, yes, euphemism for chaos, overwhelmed. Yes, these are perfect. These are all perfect, right? So for me, very similar, right? It was struggle, right? That semester was so hard, right? For all of the reasons, right? And so I wanted to think about that in real time, right? Is understanding how, what the struggle was from that student experience, right? And graduate students, Lauren Clance and Randy Cannon have been kind of jumping into this kind of struggle and understanding student struggle with me. And so really thinking about that transition, right, away from in-class learning and the kind of the stability that we had to jumping into this kind of electronic virtual learning, right? What was that like for our students? Right, and we found, right, so we did a survey asking students about if they're experiencing struggle. Of course, almost every student was, right? So 70% of the biology students at South Alabama were experiencing struggle, right? There was no difference in any sort of demographic grouping, right? So racial groups, which is portrayed on the figure here, right? Gender, first generation college students, every single student struggled. There was really no difference between any of those groups. So 70%, 7 out of 10 students were struggling. But fortunately, right, most of the students that were struggling were able to overcome those struggles by the end of the semester, right? So 80% of that 70 able to overcome. Again, whether students were able to overcome that struggle or not was not tied to any of the demographic groupings that we had, which is also good, right? That's a good sign. But the reality, right? So at South Alabama, we're a little smaller than y'all up at UAB, right? We only have about 2,200 students that were taking a biology course in that spring 2020 semester. So 70% of that 80, think about that other 20%, that's still about 315-ish students never overcame that struggle, right? And so that's a problem. And so then we wanted to dive into kind of the open-ended responses, right? So why were students struggling, right? So we asked a few different open-ended questions depending on whether students, how they responded to whether were they struggling, and then were they able to overcome, right? So either students never struggled, we wanted to find out how or why, or your response suggests that you encountered struggle, but you overcame it. Tell us, can you please explain how that happened? Or, you were in the struggling group and you never overcame it. Please help us understand why, right? And then we collected kind of those open-ended responses. And so I'm going to fly a few of these in, and we can see if we can try to draw any sort of big patterns from what we see. Right, so this is a green, so this was a no struggle student, right? The only struggle I encountered was a lack of internet access. The instructor was amazing and was very helpful during that transition. Awesome, right? So a little bit of struggle, but just around internet. I began my semester with not really being able to get a good grasp on the material, but with the numerous resources that both South and the professors offered, I started seeing improvement. Fantastic. Right? Another student that struggled and overcame. I struggled with the transition from in-class to online, but my professor has been very helpful with making the transition easier in response to all emails very quickly. Awesome. And I felt I struggled more in these classes than expected when we were forced to switch over to online learning. For some professors, the workload got surprisingly heavier. In my blog course, I had trouble adapting to the way my professor taught and did their tests. It was just hard to find the right way to study for their class. And then learning online was more time consuming as well as difficult, but quizzes and homework didn't adjust. I am not a non-traditional student and the primary caretaker of my siblings and had to move back home because my mom and brother are immunocompromised. My mom left to be in isolation as not to contract the virus. This too added to the difficult course material. So what do y'all see any patterns or themes in these student responses? Any sort of overall patterns or themes?
Generally, things that are, I guess, part of their home life that caused difficulties.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, lots of home life that we can't foresee. Like we don't see that. Amanda in the chat nailed it. Professor support was important, right? So all of these responses mentioned the instructors, right, in some way, right? So whether they said specifically my instructors were helpful or my instructors prohibited me from learning, or quizzes and homework didn't adjust. Well, those things never adjust. Those are just things, but faculty can adjust the homework and quizzes, right? And so everything was tied to the instructor, right? Or whether or not students were able to overcome or not struggle. And when we kind of did a quick analysis, that's kind of exactly what we found, right? So when we kind of lumped and put those into different categories, when students didn't struggle, they often noted that they had positive interactions and positive relationships with their instructors, right? So instructors were key for students that didn't struggle or that were able to overcome their struggles. One of the bigger ones with overcame their struggles, students were able to shift their study habits, often was noted through the help or support of the instructors, right? And so the instructors were able to kind of shift them into different study habits. And then one of the other interesting ones that really popped out was this self-confidence. And so students believed that they could do better, or they believed that they could do this, right? Which is also kind of tied, right? We as instructors can facilitate this kind of confidence building, right? We can be cheerleaders, we can be supports for our students, right? And so we can help build them up, right? And so whether or not students were able to kind of persevere through this struggle and the stress of that transition to online was tied mostly to us as instructors, right? So we have a really important role in this area. Okay, so gonna keep going in that COVID in the COVID world. right? And so we know that since COVID-19 has hit, right, that it has disproportionately impacted people in our country, right? So we know that communities of color, lower income, and urban populations have been hit harder than other groups of individuals, right? And we know that there's a huge racial disparities. We know that there's huge urbanization disparities as well, right? And as colleges started making decisions, right? I'm not sure when y'all at UAB decided to come back or others at other institutions, but last fall, we really started trying to make that transition, right? We just built a brand new football stadium. And so, you know, there was a lot of push to have, you know, in-person events, right? And I thought it was really funny that, you know, the one of the marketing campaigns last year for us in bringing students back into campus, Jag Pride, it's contagious. And, you know, and we're kind of pushed hard to start bringing back in-person classes as well, right? And so then when we were kind of being pushed to bring students back to campus, I started thinking about, well, what about worry and stress that these students are experiencing, right? So we started asking students about their fear and worry about contracting COVID, right? How much worry do you have about passing it to family members? How much worry do you have about food insecurity, right? How has COVID impacted their stress, right? We asked them about kind of physiological responses, sleeplessness, you know, having bad dreams, all sorts of stuff, right? And we found when we thought about worry, right? So we did had a bunch of questions. We did some factor analyses, right? One of the big factors that stuck out was this questions related to COVID worry, right? We found that students from non-white backgrounds experienced higher COVID worry relative to white peers. Additionally, we found that women and students that reported as gender expressive, and so I will also kind of caveat this gender expressive group. We know that this is a terrible way to kind of lump students, right? Each of these students that responds as gender expressive has a very unique gender identity, right? But this is kind of the way to try to give some weight to students that identify as non-gender binary, gender queer, gender fluid, trans, right? And it's kind of a catch-all bucket. And so I hate that I lumped them, but it was kind of you know, helpful for being able to do some analyses, right? And so we saw that, you know, communities of color and women, gender expressive students had higher COVID worry relative to white male peers. And so then we were also curious about kind of questions about food insecurity and found very similar patterns, right? Students of color reported higher worries of food insecurity relative to their white peers. But one of the kind of the COVID worries that we found didn't really translate into increased stress response, right? So in terms of sleeplessness, bad dreams, heart pounding, but we found that only the big difference relative to the white peers was students from an Indigenous or Native American background. We found no differences between men and women. However, our gender expressive students also did have higher stress responses to kind of that COVID worry, right? And so even in this like one kind of simple specific example of COVID-19 and how it impacts our students in our classrooms, we see huge inequalities within our student populations, right? And so we know that students of color and gender expressive students had higher worry, had higher stress to attend class, right? And so then it becomes a question, are those students then forced to carry this higher cognitive burden when they're enrolled in our classes, right? And is that fair to those students? And we also know that students aren't just these single identities, right? Students are complex, right? Students aren't just women. Students aren't just a race or a cultural background, right? They're filled with multiple identities at the same time, right? And this idea of intersectionality, right? That interconnected nature of these different identities, such as race and class and gender, and they often have kind of these co-correlations with some of the systems of discrimination or disadvantage that they face, right? And kind of every student that we have in our class, right, is this kind of complex being of all these individual identities, right? And they're surrounded by students that also have these complex social identities, right? And so kind of transitioning into some of the identity work that we're currently working on, right? So my group, we ask students about a lot of their social identities, right? We ask lots of identity questions, right? So first gen status, right? Political affiliation, religiosity, their spirituality, right? Their living situation, whether they were born in internationally, what size of community they grew up in, right? Any sort of science identities that they share, right? And then we ask lots of questions to really dive deep into the student experience, right? So we think about things at kind of the classroom level, right? So how much time do you spend thinking about your own identity in your classes? How do you approach group work in those classes? What's your sense of belonging? How much pressure do you feel to hide your identity? And then we also ask them questions about kind of the next scale up, right? How much comfort they have in their discipline or their major, right? So how inclusive do you think your STEM discipline is, or how inclusive do you think your department is? What's your sort of STEM career aspirations, right? And we ask them lots of questions about, the institutional scale too. How valued do you feel at the institution that you're at, right? And so we have this kind of multi-scale approach that we're talking about student identities as well. And so one of the identities projects that we're working on is thinking about how both hidden and visible student identities shape in-class experiences. So at that kind of classroom scale. And this is work done by graduate student Madison Nelson, right? This is part of her master's thesis, right? And so we've been kind of collecting these survey responses, right? And so I'm going to fly in a few of these open-ended responses, right? So this first student, right? I've been raised in a Christian home and at a Christian school for my whole life. So we did not learn biology this way. I really struggled with the almost insulting parts of the lecture that discussed human beings so similar to other animals. This caused a rift with some of my other students in the class because they assume I'm uneducated due to my religion, and they could be very rude. Right? Another student, as a Black student, it's easy to feel somewhat left out and ignored in class where no one else shares your background or identity. I was one of only 3 Black students in a small class, and my professor repeatedly got my name mixed up with the only other Black girl in the class. This never occurred with the rest of my non-Black classmates. It felt really insensitive and hurtful. My sexual identity and cultural identity impacted my experience. As a gay male, I find it hard to communicate with people sometimes, even if I want to. As a Latino, I also find it difficult to talk to a lot of peers as they had completely different backgrounds. And then finally, I struggle all the time with being an older student with a high school education very far from my memory and peers very far out of my range in understanding them. Being low income, I can barely afford books, fancy laptops, or even homework programs required to help me learn better. Right, and so what Madison is doing from all of these responses is she's going in and she's coding the different identities, right? So coding the different identities in blue, and then kind of collecting what that student experience is like, right? So feeling somewhat left out and ignored, right? Repeatedly got my name mixed up, insensitive and hurtful, right? And these are kind of all negative connotations, right? All the examples I picked all had sort of these negative connotations associated with these different identities. But it shows that students in real time are interweaving their different identities, right? You can't separate these different social identities from within who our students are, right? And so we're kind of following up with some of these student experiences. And my postdoctoral researcher, Angela Google, who is amazing, has been conducting different interviews with these students. And so we're trying to interview students from a diverse array of backgrounds, and really trying to understand their comfort in courses, their comfort at the institution, their instructor awareness and sensitivities, right? So what sort of barriers do they experience to success, or what sort of bridges have they experienced to find success? What their peer relationships look like, and trying to understand and get tips from students of how we as an institution, how we as a biology department, and ourselves as teachers that teach in classrooms can improve the climate for our diverse student body, right? South is a cool, diverse campus. We have a lot of amazing students, right? And so we're collecting all this interview data with students in hopes to then put this forward to build up some cultural competency workshops for our graduate students, our faculty and staff at the university, right? And so Dr. Angela Google is working with Dr. Shane Bierma, who is a staff psychologist with LSU in New Orleans, and their psychiatry department, to help kind of bring all this student data together for these cultural competency workshops, right? That are going to be kind of data informed, right? They're going to be built around the student experiences at South Alabama. We're going to help try to, build kind of off the framework of Safe Zone. So if y'all are familiar with Safe Zone, it's going to be kind of a similar kind of structure, right? To where we have a piece where we help faculty understand their own biases, right? And give them some time to role play, right? Helping provide faculty with different vocabulary, definitions to be able to engage students from diverse sexual, gender, ethnic, racial, cultural identities, right? We want faculty to be able to communicate with all of our students. We want to do some role playing, right? To build some confidence up, to actually use that vocabulary when they jump into their own classroom, right? And we want to help faculty see some of the barriers that some of our historically excluded students are facing within our classrooms, within our university, right? And we really want to push the faculty to see their role as allies or advocates, right? So one of the issues we have at South in our biology department is our faculty representation does not match what our student body is, right? So we look different than what our students look like, right? And we can't do anything about that right now. We can long term, yes, we can with our strategic hires, but right now we can be allies, right? Right now we can be advocates, right? And we really want to push faculty to really think about inclusive course design and really thinking about how they include representation within the classes that they teach, right? And so to kind of circle us back, I'm coming in for a landing here, right? We know that we have a problem in STEM, right? We know that students from these historically excluded identities choose to leave STEM at disproportionate rates. Most of our students are struggling right now, right? With COVID, with the realities of what our world is right now. And some of these students might be feeling extra burden because of the decisions that are coming down from above them at the administrative level, right? We as faculty members can make or break the student experience, right? We can be a bridge or we can be a barrier, right? But we have to be ready. We have to be ready to be a bridge, right? We have to educate ourselves. We have to do the work. right? And so with that, I'm gonna kind of leave off on kind of how we patch those leaks, and I'm happy to take any questions y'all might have.
All right, well, thanks, Jeremiah. So anybody that's got questions, please feel free to unmute yourself and just ask away, or put them in the chat, and we can kind of monitor them through there. I guess.
Did we lose Jeff? Gregory, I'm sorry.
Hi, Jeremiah. Thanks for that talk. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, I sure can.
Okay, great. So here's a question, and I want to be clear. So sometimes in science, we elevate hypothesis-driven research and pretend that that's the be-all and end-all. I am not trying to take that perspective, but I wanted to just ask, as you go through all these interviews with students about their identities and their challenges, do you have specific hypotheses in mind, or do you feel like it's more about just gathering the information and the perspectives at this point?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think for some things we have pretty specific hypotheses that we're testing, but a lot of the interviews and stuff are actually just trying to just get an assessment of what is out there, right? It's, that classic kind of observational study, right? Of we're just trying to get the lay of the land at South Alabama. And we, once we get a lay of the land, then we can start building work with a little more kind of testable and quantifiable hypotheses.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
We have a question in the chat from Melissa Harris, who asks, what are some actionable suggestions you have used that have worked?
Yeah, that's a good question. And so I think, for myself, it's just including, try to include as much diverse representation within examples when you're putting together, pulling together slides or pulling in examples. Trying to do as much activities and like in-class work as possible, because you can, during that activities, you can actually get in and, connect, with students in a very small group or one-on-one or one-on-two, and you can really build that connection with students. And I think just that willingness to try to connect with as many students personally as you can, I think is helpful. Yeah, so Sarah also asked, so I hope that helps. There's probably a bunch of different ways I could think of. I'm blanking. And so Melissa, if you have questions, I can try to follow up. But Sarah asked, what aspects of my own identity do I often share about myself during my teaching? And so I always, on the first day of class, I always talk about kind of my experiences as a scientist, right? So I am a first gen college student, right? So my parents are blue collar factory workers, right? And so I talk about the what sort of experiences I had and kind of some of the challenges that I felt or experienced kind of jumping through, the ladder or climbing up the ladder. And so this is also why I'm really passionate about this kind of work of trying to build more bridges and removing some of those barriers.
Hey, Jeremiah, I have a question. So the paper that you guys put out last year, I found very fascinating because I never really thought about this difference between, I guess, visible identities and concealable identities.
Mm-hmm.
You really can't conceal your race or your gender, your age, but your religion, your politics, your sexual orientation, things like that. You have the option, I guess, to either conceal or share.
Yeah.
How do the difference between those two kinds of groups of identities, how does that play into how you deal with students?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, because you can make assumptions, right, based on appearance, right? That you can maybe guess at someone's race. It doesn't mean you're right? That's one of the hard parts about the visible identities. You can make a guess, but you may or may not be correct. But yeah, the visibles are in the hiddens are really difficult because you really don't have any aspect, right? And so this is the importance of like not making any sort of assumptions about your students, because ultimately you don't know, right? And so I always just try to be very vulnerable with my students and be really open, right? So like on the first day of class, I always disclose that I'm first gen and try to personally connect with students. And so try to build that comfort up where they're willing to share, you know, some of their identities, or, you know, who they are as individuals. And of course, probably a lot of students still don't, right? They still are concealing whatever identities that they have, but, you know, trying to make as supportive of a climate in class, and trying to have hard and fast rules about being a supportive, kind of open kind of community in the classroom. I think you can facilitate that sharing, right? Because I think it's important and it's powerful for breaking students out of their stereotypes or assumptions of who people are or what people are, right? It's a challenge. You have to challenge some of those stereotypes sometimes. I don't know if that answered your question at all.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
I kind of have a question about when you use teamwork in class. There's lots of data out there saying that diverse teams are really good, but there's also data out there saying that diverse teams might not be so good because students who like to be with other students who look like them. And I see both sides. So I was kind of curious to how you handle this kind of challenge when you're making teams, since you mentioned you do teams in your class in ecology.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that's a great question. So that was actually one of the motivators for this identities paper, was because we know that active learning is beneficial for students, and doing teamwork is beneficial for students, or for most students, right? But are we losing some of those kind of fringe students that are afraid to share their identities? And that is part of the reality, that we likely are. We could be further marginalizing these students that already are super marginalized in our STEM classrooms. I guess I try to use kind of a combination of mixing students, you know, organically, or like letting them self-select sometimes, but then also will try to force them, or like, I guess I will pre-select them or pre-sort them into groups. We also spend it's so cringeworthy. Like, I would have hated as a student, but I do spend a lot of time on the first day doing lots of icebreakers. And so students, I feel like trying to get them to like connect with each other on day one, even in some of these kind of larger enrollment, 150, 200 student classes, of trying to get them just to talking and communicating and doing some of these icebreaker activities, right? It's painful. It's really painful the first day or two, but students quickly like meet each other, right? They through that way. And once they meet each other, I think it starts breaking down some of those barriers, or some of that kind of I guess kind of fear, or kind of feeling marginalized or feeling excluded in some of that group work. And so lots of icebreakers, even though they're painful. I guess that would be my advice.
Do you have any other questions? All right, well then let's thank Jeremiah for a great talk.
Thank you.
Cool. All right, everybody. Well, I will see you guys in October at our next meeting. Thanks a lot, Jeremiah, and I'll see everybody later.
Awesome. Thank you.